Hey YouTube, Time Itself here with more Kerbal Space Program. We're going to take this monstrosity of a rocket to Moho, the closest planet to the Kerbal Sun, and hopefully make it back home, collecting lots of science along the way. Oh, this is going to be yeah, and it's going to spin, isn't it? Because it's flexing in that. Yep. Alright. But that's what you get when you just design your rocket by, oh, we don't have enough delta V to get where I want to go yet. Add more, and keep going until you get there. That I could do with the redesign, but I think this will get the job done. My estimate is that I'll need about 1500 meters per second delta V to land on Moho and then return to Kerbin. And there go the solid boosters. This is a very slow launch. As I said, I could do with the redesign of this rocket. My thrust-to-weight ratio when I dropped the solid boosters was under 1.2 for a second. That's just a bit concerning, but I do make it into orbit just fine. I mean, it's not too much for a Kerbal Space Program when you've only got 4 stages in your initial lift, and then the 5th one is what starts you into your circular orbit around Kerbin, and then starts the interplanetary phase. No, that's perfectly reasonable for Kerbal Space Program. Taking a look at the big map, we're coming from Kerbin, the 3rd planet, towards Moho, the closest planet, which means we're going to slow down in our orbit so that we fall towards the sun, and eventually meet up with Moho. Okay, on to the next stage. So far, things have been going really well, but as I zoom out to the big map, I notice that I have an issue. I am nowhere near in the same orbital plane as Moho, and that's going to make meeting up with it really hard. I end up making a 1600 meter per second burn in order to get in the right orbital plane, and then I take a couple extra orbits around the sun in order to get my encounter, but I do get it. And as I finally come into Moho's sphere of influence, I have a pleasant surprise. I am already pretty much in the orbit I want to be, coming in right over the pole, and that's so that I can do some mapping before I land. I am going to make a minor course correction in order to get myself at the right altitude with the periaps and right over the pole, but I couldn't have done much better. The issue is that we are less than 2 hours from escaping Moho's sphere of influence. Which means we need to slow down a lot pretty soon. Orbital velocity 2800 meters per second. But once I make that small burn, I have a little bit of time to do some science. I've brought along 2 science juniors and 2 goo canisters that aren't going to make it to the surface of Moho, or at least they're not going to survive landing on the surface of Moho. So I'm going to take data from high above Moho from both of them, and I'm going to transmit one set back and then grab the other from EVA and store them so that I can actually keep them and bring them back to Kerbin for as much science as possible. It's just a little tricky navigating around outside, getting close enough to the science experiments in order to grab the stuff, but eventually I make it, and we make it back inside the spacecraft before we need to make that burn to go into orbit around Moho. Alright, so what's going on here? Why am I in this polar orbit at this height? Well, one of the mods that I've got here is the SCANSat planetary mapping mod, and one of the pieces of equipment from the mod that I have is a radar altimeter, and what I'm going to do is go over the surface of the planet and scan it, and slowly I'll build up a map of the surface of the planet. Not at super high resolution, but it will be useful to me. And just before I finish that burn, I run out of fuel in the extra tanks that have the science juniors and goo canisters attached to them, so I've already transmitted or collected the science, so there they go. And we are, in fact, we're going to get sunlight the entire time. Excellent. The trouble with mapping Moho is that a day on Moho is 14 regular days. Normally you go into a polar orbit and let the planet rotate below you, but if I pull up the map, you can see the ground track, and there's not much difference where this orbit's going to pass over and where the next orbit's going to pass over. The SCANSat mod also includes a biomes mapping tool, but Moho doesn't have biomes, so I don't need it here. Blue is my projected orbit. Orange is my previous orbit. Okay, but as I let Moho rotate beneath me, I map more and more of the planet, a bit more than halfway done at this point. You can also tell why I need a polar orbit. If I was in an equatorial orbit, I'd just keep scanning the area around the equator. A polar orbit means I can scan the entire planet. As I near completion of my map, I run into a little bit of an issue. The planet, my orbit has rotated around the planet, and so I'm no longer always in the sunlight. And that means my solar power stops working, and eventually, because the mapping tool takes a lot of power, my batteries get drained, and I end up with a blank spot in my map. I'm guessing the time acceleration had something to do with the where and how, but as I toned down the time acceleration, I managed to scan most of the area that I'd missed. But of course I drained my batteries before I get out of the shadow of the planet. Oh, yep, and there it went out. We are out of power, just sitting here waiting for us to come back around, and once we do... Come on. Unfortunately, I'm just going to have a little bit of a hole in my map, a couple pixels missing. That shouldn't be a problem though, and as soon as we get back into the sunlight, things start working again. Okay, so our big map is looking pretty good, but, well, I want to find somewhere to land, and Moho is pretty rough. So it's not just height I want to look at, but terrain roughness, and this mod has the feature to show me that. Hopefully it shows up on YouTube okay. And so with this map, we can see the rims of the craters. We can also make out a lot of the areas that are really rough and we really need to avoid. Now, I want to land somewhere near the equator so that when I take back off again, I'm in the right plane, so that I can return to Kerbal without too much trouble. I also don't really want to have to make a major course correction in order to get to where I want to be, or without waiting too long. And so I think my best choice is there's a small crater just north of the equator, maybe 3 or 4 orbital periods ahead of where I am right now. So I'll go ahead and wait until my orbit's going to come over that, and then I'll burn and I'll deorbit right into the crater. Hopefully that will work out fairly well. So first I time accelerate, and then I set up the deorbit burn, probably about on the opposite side of the planet of where I want to land. Maybe just a little bit further forward, since the periapsis is actually going to be inside the planet, so that I land, and then not quite, just a little bit past where I want to land. And then make the burn. It's actually really cool watching the ground map change as I fire the engines, but it doesn't take a whole lot before I get to where I want to be. And we are headed right into that crater. Haha! Alright. Now that I've put myself on a collision course, I begin to have second thoughts. You know, I hope we do that while it's, while we have sunlight. Well, yeah, we'll have a little bit. So as I approach Moho, I'm going about 900 meters per second, which is about 2,000 miles per hour. Moho doesn't have an atmosphere, a nice poofy atmosphere to help slow me down. So this is just a little bit scary as the crater that I'm headed for slowly comes into sight, and I realize I did a little bit too much of my deorbit burn, and so I'm going to have to let myself get pretty far along before I start slowing down so that I land in the crater. As you can see, the area outside the crater is pretty rough and uneven, and that could be really tricky to land on. I'm not the best with these landing things. You give me a flat surface and plenty of fuel and I can make it happen, but if it's not that, I am in trouble. For example, I ran this simulation. This isn't real, this is just a simulation of what would happen if I landed just randomly somewhere on Moho. Moho doesn't have a whole lot of gravity, it was about 1/4 of a G, but just on a slope somewhere, and would see what would happen to my spacecraft. And it didn't go very well, so we want to land somewhere flat so we can avoid this, the results of this simulation. As it turns out, I end up slowing myself down some and also burning towards the sky. There's no air, so I can't say into the air. That wouldn't make sense. In order to keep myself going a little bit further so I get closer to the middle of that crater where I suspect it's going to be a little bit flatter. But after a couple tense minutes, we finally get somewhere. Oh. Well, what do you know? Okay, well, there's a little bit of a slope, but we can deal with that. Oh, I see my shadow. I see my shadow. Given that I have sufficient thrust-away ratio for the surface, something like 5, I have plenty of fuel, I don't need to worry about that too much, and I found somewhere flat to land that all comes together fairly nicely. I made it! Ha-ha! And so we have Bill Kerman, who's climbing down the ladder and is going to be my first Kerbal to make it to Moho. I have not been here before. Pretty cool. Actually, it's pretty hot. That's a really big sun. Let's see what the EVA report says. Yeah, I think it would be hot there. So we're going to run the goo canister and Science Junior on the surface here, grab the data out of them, and then I'll run the other goo and Science Junior right as we take off, so I get Science from low over Moho. Well, it'd be a lot easier to do it while I'm taking off rather than landing, as landing is tricky and taking off is fairly straightforward. You know, I say, hey, that should be easy, but I actually end up making a mistake here. It's not a big one, but I end up burning west instead of east and going around the planet in the opposite direction I had intended. Not a big deal, but it'll cost me just a little bit more fuel when I make my transfer burn to Kerbal. Yes, it did take almost 2 years to get to Moho, and then we spent less than 5 minutes on the surface, but that's how you do things. Anyway, grab the Science out of the Science Junior and goo canister and start messing around with maneuver nodes, trying to get an encounter with Kerbal. And I get one, and it's really weird, but I figure, hey, let's go ahead and do it. Why did I... This transfer is going to send me well above the plane that most of the planets are in. Why would you do that? I don't know. But honestly, playing around with the maneuver nodes, trying to get very precise transfers is tricky. If it says I'm going to get something, I'm going to go ahead and do it. But I finally used up all the fuel that was in the stage with the landing legs and the Science Juniors and the goo canisters and some extra solar cells. And so we say goodbye to all of that, and we keep going back towards Kerbal. I mean, if I needed to perform another 1600 meter per second plane change maneuver, I don't think I would be able to do that. I would end up looking for things, trying to get gravity assist from Eve or something. Normally I wouldn't bother with that. But fortunately, I've got my encounter. All I need to do is just get into Kerbal's atmosphere, and everything will work out. I do have to make a couple more correction burns to get my encounter where I want it to, but it's gonna happen. I've got plenty of delta V left. Looks like 600 plus meters per second. Alright, and we have a maneuver node plotted out that will give us a direct encounter with Kerbal. That is a couple days in the future, but for now we're going to have another launch to worry about. Everything looks good, but we'll have to wait till next time to tally up the science. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.